Two former directors of communication to Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Mulroney are behind an effort to start a new, well, sort of conservative-based television, public affairs and news channel in Canada. Some people are calling it Fox North, after the American channel that appeals to rock-ribbed Republicans. We're joined to talk about whether this will work or not in Calgary by Ezra Levant, who is a no-nonsense conservative, and in Montreal today, though he broadcasts from Toronto, by John Moore of News Talk 1010. Mr. Levant, first, what is the need for a third television news and public affairs channel appealing specifically to conservatives?
Well, I'm not sure if it's going to appeal so much to conservatives as to the public in general. I mean, let me tell you a shocking statistic, Craig, and I think you know this. The #1 all-news channel in Canada is not CTV Newsnet, and it's not CBC News World. It's CNN from the States. And I think that's shocking that in Canada, Canadians don't choose a Canadian news source first. So obviously there's something missing in the market. And I'm not being mean to CTV. I'm just reporting the facts. Let me say one more thing about Canadian news viewers. We like to think we're very well informed, especially compared to our American friends. But we actually watch only about a quarter as much news as they do. So there's a huge demand for news. It's not being met by the Canadian outlets. I think the idea of having a third news channel is great. At conservative, liberal, whatever. Let's just have more choice.
Mr. Moore, I'm going to get you into this in a minute, but first I have to keep going with Mr. Levant here for a second. You've been talking to somebody, because you're backing away totally from the idea that this is going to be Fox North or a channel that's going to appeal to conservatives specifically over others, or reflecting sort of conservative right-wing views. You're backing away from that idea totally.
Well, I mean, people who call it Fox North, I think they're just looking for some sort of comparison, and Fox is pretty spicy. But, you know, is there any basis for making that comparison? Look at the first two people hired by Quebecor. The first is David Aiken, who I think used to work for CTV. I think he's a pretty straight shooter. I wouldn't call him necessarily right-wing or left-wing. I just think he's a good reporter. I don't know his politics. The other person hired is Brian Lilly, who used to work for John's station, CFRB. Again, a straight shooter, a real reporter. I think people who label it Fox North are trying to put it in a box that so far the facts don't suggest. There's a word for prejudging something. It's called prejudice. And I think let Quebecor have its say. Now, I mean, let me tell you, like so many people out there, I'm excited about this. Okay. And by the way, I have not received an offer.
I'm just going to say, have they hired you yet? Come on, have they hired you yet?
No, they haven't, and I haven't received an offer. But my point is, let's have some more voices out there. I think it probably would be more conservative than CTV or CBC, but that's not saying much.
Mr. Moore, this is being started by a man who runs this is by Quebecor. His owner owns Sun newspaper, which is very much conservative newspapers. The two principals involved are well-known, strong conservatives. They both work for prime ministers. Doesn't that suggest to you that this is going to be a conservative-based network?
I would imagine so. I mean, certainly, you know, Corey Tanecki showed his usual adeptness when he was dismissing Don Newman of the CBC, his complaints about the possibility of a conservative network, by calling him the Helen Thomas of Canada. That's the kind of you know, inflamed partisanship that we don't see a lot. That said, I think I agree entirely with Ezra. This is good for business, and you know, it's actually great for me, because I'm a liberal or a centrist, whatever you want to call me, who's mostly made his career in conservative media. But all that said, it's interesting to hear what Ezra is saying, because I have a feeling, Ezra, that there's a certain closeness you may have with the project, even if there's no deals signed. But the greatest con job ever committed in American right-wing media was the notion that the mainstream media, as they like to call it, or the dreaded MSM, was implicitly and partisanly liberal. Therefore, they could set up something like Fox, which is explicitly and partisanly conservative. And actually what that has succeeded in doing is not only creating a very partisan conservative media, but also in pushing the mainstream media more to the right, because they're terrified of being seen as not balanced.
So, Mr. Levant, if you're right that this is just going to be your usual news public affairs network, no different than the other two that exist now, then really, who needs it? We're struggling for audiences. We are, all of us. We don't need another news channel, I don't think. Why do you?
Well, I'm not I don't speak for Quebecor, but I'm not saying it's not going to be different. I think it's going to be very different. Frankly, if I had to make a guess, I think it's going to be spicier. I think they're going to try and be, I think they are going to be different. But just pigeonholing it as Fox News North or saying it's going to be just right-wing stuff, so far the facts are different. I mean, with their first two hires. Oh, I think it's going to be very different. It's like when the National Post came around in 1998. It really shook up the industry. They are a very different newspaper. I'd say they are more conservative than the others, but they have liberal voices. Quick example, the CBC every week gives a radical left-wing activist called David Suzuki a full hour for his propaganda. And there is no voice on the other side, even though most Canadians are skeptical of global warming. I think that this new channel, if I had to guess, will probably have a diversity of opinion, not just the conventional wisdom, probably a diversity of opinion on things like terrorism, global warming, the gun registry. So I think it's actually going to have more views than just one side.
Now, Mr. Levant here, Mr. Moore, is reflecting something I'm hearing from conservatives all the time, occasionally about CTV, but especially about the Corp, the CBC, that they are a lefty network and need to be balanced. Now, really, you know, I don't always hear that. Do you?
Well, I mean, I do because, for example, the National Post used to have something called CBC Watch, where they were constantly going after the CBC. But, you know, when you're delivering media on 12 platforms, 12 hours a day, inevitably somebody's going to start complaining about one show or another. It is fun to hear Ezra call David Suzuki a propagandist, because when he's talking about dung beetles, I don't think he's taking a lot of positions on anything. And, you know, this caprice that there's actually an open question about global warming and its existence. There are tons of open questions about what is going to happen and what to do about it. But the existence of global warming, this idea that if you're going to have a debate about it, you got to have one person who says it doesn't happen and one person to say it does. They used to say with, you know, George W. Bush that if he said the world was flat, the headline would have to be "Shape of World in Dispute."
Gentlemen, thank you for this. We will be watching, or maybe we won't be watching. We'll see what the CRT says. Bye for now.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Bye-bye.